Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And thank you for that introduction, Lindsay. And thank you very much to Keith, Lindsay, Charles, and all of the team for inviting me back to give this year's keynote. This year's theme of collective care, collective power speaks to what I think is one of the most important tenets of Solarpunk, the idea that we must work together towards a better future for all of us. And so today, I want to talk about how that relates to the idea of cooperative forms of housing. So I'll start by saying this. Despite what you might think, you are not an individual. You are a collective. This mass of tissues that you identify with being your body is far more complicated than that. Your body is actually a community of symbiotic life forms, including bacteria, viruses, fungi, and archaea that make up a microbiome. And within this microbiome, it's estimated that human cells are outnumbered by a ratio of 10 to 1. And the total number of non-human genes in the microbiome outnumber the human genes by a factor of 100. All of these human cells are estimated to account for as much as 5 pounds of the body weight of a healthy 200-pound human. Similarly, on an entirely different scale, you are but one tiny part of the biosphere that includes all life on this planet. Humans account for only 2.5% of animal biomass and only 0.01% of the total biomass on the planet. And so we must come to understand that we are all inextricably enmeshed with every other living thing on the planet. Despite this scientific fact, the idea of rugged individualism persists in the mythos of Western society, particularly in the United States. And the foundation of this mythos runs deep. The Canadian political scientist C.B. Macpherson suggested that today's capitalist market economy and its possessive individualism can be traced back to 17th and 18th century English thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. The American biologist Mary E. Clark echoes this in her essay, Tasks for Future Ecologists, in which she suggests that Western social paradigms and scientific paradigms tend to continually reinforce each other without very much critical reflection on why. This results in the type of thinking that suggests that the current capitalist system has evolved out of some sort of natural law, rather than recognizing the truth that it has been fabricated by humans. We have to realize that economics is not a science. It is a narrative, a fiction created by humans in an attempt to understand the world. And as a fiction, its rules can be rewritten. If we look beyond the dominant and colonizing culture of the West and the global North, we find countless examples of cultures that focus not on the individual, but on the collective. For instance, in Africa, the Zulu word for humanity, Ubuntu, has come to represent the philosophy of many African tribes that emphasizes the interconnectedness of individuals with others in their surrounding world. And it's often summarized in the phrase, I am because we are. Similarly, the Nuu-chah-nulth people of the Pacific Northwest, in what's now known as Canada, the word Sawak means one. And the indigenous scholar and hereditary chief Umik, in his book Principles of Sawak, uses the word to express the view that all living things, humans, plants, animals, form part of an integrated whole brought into harmony through constant negotiation and mutual respect for the other. The indigenous American botanist and author Robin Wall Kimmerer's wonderful little book, The Serviceberry, focuses on the acts of giving and sharing, and she notes that we tend to take better care of things that are given as gifts than things purchased as commodities. And she also observes that the act of giving and receiving is far more social than that of purchasing. She goes on to argue that modern capitalist economics is framed by a false sense of scarcity, which encourages hoarding wealth. In contrast to this, she counters that the field of ecological economics recognizes that true wealth is having enough to share. Kimmerer refutes the traditional understanding of the tragedy of the commons, which states that self-interested individuals will attempt to maximize their own personal benefit from a shared resource until that commons falls into ruin. Kimmerer argues that this idea has been used as justification for commodifying what was once understood as a shared gift, and that it serves to convert a commonly held source of abundance into individual property in order to safeguard it against tragedy. In other words, according to the traditional understanding of the tragedy of the commons, there is no alternative. Only capitalism can save us. But Eleanor Ostrom's studies of what she calls common pool resources tells a different story. Her work, which earned her the Nobel Prize in Economics, challenged the view that resources must be either privately owned or controlled by the state in order to be preserved, and instead identified a set of principles that would enable successful self-governance of common resources. Kimmerer also references the work of evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson, who has found that competition makes sense only when the unit of evolution is the individual. When the focus shifts to the level of the group, to the population, cooperation is the better model. In Kristen Godsey's book, Everyday Utopia, she explores how this same sort of kind of unreflective, individualistic thinking, criticized by McPherson, Clark, and Kimmerer, has led us to a world dominated by individual apartment flats, single-family homes, and an almost blind faith in the idea of the nuclear family. Our way of living, the very design of the dwellings we inhabit, she says, perpetuates the social norm that many types of care work must be provided within the individual household, and usually by women. She goes on to suggest that more communal forms of dwelling can make everyone's lives less lonely, less harried, and less deleterious to the environment. And this seemingly natural relationship between a single family and a single household is even embedded in our language. The Greek word for family, oikos, is also the Greek word for house. Similarly, the Roman word for the nuclear family, domus, is the word for the large single-family houses of the Roman elite. And what Godsey's book tells us is that there have always been alternatives to the one family, one house paradigm that seems to be the status quo, and that there are countless examples throughout different times and cultures where people chose to live communally. And what we end up seeing in Godsey's book is that the act of sharing all kinds of things is one of the common threads amongst all of these alternative ways of living in the world. And so, as Penny Clark says here, sharing is a skill enabled by both spatial and social infrastructures, and one that can help us live more sustainably. And so today I want to examine how rethinking the spatial infrastructures of our lives, the very homes in which we live, can lead to a more sustainable solarpunk world by suggesting that different forms of cooperative living can support this effort. Now, before I really get going, I want to make an important note. Almost all of the projects that I'll show today come from the global north. And this is largely because cooperative forms of housing and living in common are already common, if not the default situation, in much of the rest of the world. But at some point in the West or the global North or whatever we want to call it, the dominant mode of housing began to follow the so-called rule of one family and one housing unit. And so with that as a caveat, I'll turn to Denmark, which is widely recognized as the birthplace of modern co-housing. Now, there are two people generally understood to be the intellectual founders of the idea of co-housing. The Danish architect Jan Gudmund Højer is one of them, and the journalist Bodil Gray is the other. In 1967, Gray wrote an article entitled "Children Should Have 100 Parents," in which she advocated for a community in which all of the adults would look after all of the children and not just their own. Similarly, after a failed attempt at starting a co-housing community, in 1968, Gudmund Højer published an article entitled "The Missing Link Between Utopia and the Outdated Single-Family House." Together, these articles, which were grounded in ideas of radical feminist politics, were the seeds of the Danish co-housing movement. Eventually, in 1968, Gudmund Højer, Gray, and some of the families from the failed project were joined by new families to begin designing a community in the village of Jonstrup. This group eventually split into two, and both were successful in building the first two modern Danish co-housing communities, Skraplanet and Sætdammen. Here we see the site plan of Skraplanet, designed by Gudmund Højer, which consisted of 33 houses scattered across the site, with a common house highlighted in red and a pool forming the heart of the community. Here we see a view of it with the architect, Gudmund Højer, walking through one of the green spaces. The other project, Sætdammen, as you can see here, is much more compact and centered on a shared green courtyard and the common house highlighted in red. Some of the original families still live there today. Currently, 71 people live in the 28 houses, and they share resources like tools, laundry facilities, and outdoor toys, and share communal meals 4 times a week, usually attended by about 20 to 25 people. The land is cooperatively owned, but each family owns their own house, so the legal arrangement is something similar to an American condominium. Now, one Danish architecture professor is rumored to have called these earliest projects, quote, dentists' collectives, because of the fact that they were made up almost entirely by white, dual-income professional families, despite their radical politics. And to be fair, that's a claim that could still be made of many co-housing communities today. There's even one Italian scholar of housing who has questioned if there's really any difference between co-housing communities and typical suburban gated neighborhoods. And so in view of this, most of the projects that I'll focus on today are trying to push back against this in one way or another, including several that specifically include units dedicated to immigrant families and refugees. Now, the married American architects Catherine McCammett and Charles Durrett, who had studied in architecture in Denmark, are credited with bringing modern co-housing to the American context through their 1988 book, Co-Housing, A Contemporary Approach to Housing Ourselves. However, it's important to note that they explicitly stripped away the radical politics that were inherent in the founding of the Danish movement, claiming that, quote, co-housing offers a new approach to housing rather than a new way of life, and that they espouse no ideology. And given the radical feminist ideas expressed by both Gudmund Højer and Gray, I find this depoliticization of the co-housing movement both infuriating and a little amusing, because we see this over and over again in the literature and the websites of the majority of co-housing communities around the world, but especially those in the United States. there's a tremendous allergy to both the C words, commune and communism, and the S words, social and socialism. And every time I see it, I'm reminded of this scene from the first season of The Last of Us, when Joel and Ellie are getting a tour of the settlement in Jackson, Wyoming.
So are you, like, in charge?
No one person's in charge. I'm on the council, democratically elected, serving 300 people, including children. Everyone pitches in. We rotate patrols, food prep, repairs, hunting, harvesting.
Everything you see in our town, greenhouses, livestock, all shared. Collective ownership.
So, communism.
Nah, it ain't like that.
It is that, literally. This is a commune. We're communists.
Now, while McCammett and Durrett's book focused on the Danish bofællesskaber, or living communities, model of co-housing, several other Northern European countries, including Sweden and the Netherlands, had strong traditions of cooperative housing as well. The Swedish kollektivhuser, or collective house model, is denser and more urban than the Danish model. And one of the first was the building now known as the Markeliushuset, or Markelius House, which was built in 1935. These earliest Swedish collective housing communities were also based on feminist principles and aimed to reduce or eliminate the housework that was done by women, freeing them to pursue careers even after having children. However, rather than performing the work cooperatively, like in the Danish communities, in these communities, the work of preparing meals, cleaning, maintaining the apartments, caring for the children was all done by professional staff whose salaries were included in the rent. The Markelius house had a kindergarten, a cafe, and dumbwaiters, which we see here on the left, which delivered food directly to the apartments from the restaurant's kitchen. Now, Ole Enquist was an important figure in the Swedish collective housing movement. He built several collective housing estates, which he called family hotels. Hasselby Family Hotel is by far the largest of these estates, with over 300 apartments, ranging from single rooms with kitchenettes to 5- and 6-room apartments. And the communities included a variety of services, including an on-site restaurant, childcare, and housekeeping, performed by paid staff and meant to lighten the housekeeping load on families. And this resulted in this form of collective housing being labeled as, quote, a special solution for privileged people, and probably rightfully so. In 1969, after the death of Enquist, the new owner of Hasselby began closing down some of the common services against the wishes of the tenants. Eventually, the restaurant itself was closed, and a group of residents took over, illustrating the viability of a cooperative model similar to the communities in Denmark. Simultaneously, a group of professional women, many of them architects and journalists, known as Bo I Gemeenschap, or living in community in English, BIG for short, was advocating for a similar idea. They didn't agree with the earlier modernists that housework should be limited and shifted off to paid staff, but instead maintained that housework was the responsibility of both men and women, and that it should be understood as a valuable contribution to society. They argued that the traditional housework was cumbersome because it was inefficiently spread across all of the individual households. They argued that working collectively would save time, would make the work more enjoyable, and would be better for the kids. And as suggested in this cartoon here, they argued that if each individual housing unit gave up only 10% of their private space, it would be enough to establish a wide variety of communal services within the building without increasing the cost. The ideas outlined by BIG influenced the first Swedish co-housing project of the new generation, called Stacken in Gothenburg. In 1980, 55 people moved into the building, which included all of the common facilities that are considered standard by now. Tenants were primarily lower middle class, with many of them working in the public sector as teachers, healthcare workers, and social workers. Staaken has since been renovated to passive house standards in 2017, and the entire building, both the facades and the roof, are now skinned with solar panels that provide 100% of the building's electricity. Now, as I mentioned, the Netherlands also has a rich history of cooperative housing. The Dutch centraal wonen, or central living model of co-housing, was also minimized in McCammett and Durrett's book. It's seemingly a hybrid between the Danish and the Swedish models, and that they tend to be more urban and connected to their surrounding neighborhoods, like the Swedish projects, but in a low-rise, less dense housing typology, like those in Denmark. But there's a key difference between the Dutch and the Danish models, and that's that the collective spaces, particularly the shared kitchen and dining rooms for communal meals, tend to be decentralized and shared between smaller clusters of 4 to 5 houses rather than the whole community. And each cluster then shares a garden, a storage unit with washing machines, and this communal kitchen and dining room. And on the roof of that communal kitchen and dining room is another communal roof terrace. So with all of that as a kind of introduction and brief history of the origins of co-housing, I now want to get into why I think cooperative housing communities in their myriad forms are potentially an important ingredient in the solarpunk world that those of us gathered here today are trying to build together. I'll go into some detail on the environmental, economic, and social benefits of cooperative housing, and also note that there's definitely some blurry boundaries between these categories, and really all of the projects do some interesting things for each. So I'll start with the environmental benefits, because I think it's probably the easiest and therefore the least interesting aspect of cooperative housing. And I say that it's the easiest because I agree with Paul Chatterton, who's one of the founders of a project that we'll look at later, who says, quote, "It's fairly easy to change buildings. It's really difficult to change behaviors." And so really the architecture part's easy. All of the examples that I'll show today perform significantly better from an environmental standpoint than typical market rate private housing. The behavioral changes inherent in living cooperatively have the potential to lower the environmental impact of housing even more. Dr. Penny Clark's research into the environmental sustainability of 4 different collective housing communities in the UK showed that all 4 have significantly lower CO2 emissions, between 33% and 68% lower than the average household. This results from both infrastructural changes, like super insulated houses and the use of alternative energy sources, really the architecture, as well as sociocultural differences, the behaviors, like increases in plant-based diets, working from home, and utilizing less carbon-intensive forms of transportation. And so it's this act of sharing, which is a core value of cooperative housing, which is, I think, one of the most important behavioral changes that we can make to build towards a solarpunk world. I saw someone in my neighborhood wearing this t-shirt last week that says, "What's more punk than the public library?" And I totally agree. We need to be building a culture of libraries, a culture of sharing, libraries of books, libraries of tools, libraries of experts, libraries of clothes, libraries of toys, libraries of everything for everyone. This might be the most important seed of a post-capitalist society. Now, as we'll see today, cooperative forms of housing are a recurring theme through the work of Kim Stanley Robinson. In The Ministry for the Future, one of the main characters, Mary Murphy, who was the first head of the UN ministry that gives the book its title, moves into a housing co-op in Zurich after her retirement. And as described in the book, It was a little 20 apartment co-op, 4 stories high, and almost everyone in the co-op was part of the 2000 Watt Society, so staying low burn was not that difficult. The communal meals were vegetarian for the most part, and together, the occupants of the place owned one electric car, and there was also a sign-up sheet for it, often empty, but not always. The 2000 Watt Society concept combines both the need for sustainable buildings and significant sociocultural changes in behavior. It was introduced as an effort to reduce the average primary energy use of the citizens of affluent societies in particular to no more than 2,000 watts per year, without compromising their standard of living. 2,000 watts was chosen because, as we see here, it was the worldwide average energy expenditure. Now, the society aims to achieve this goal through 3 strategies: efficiency, sufficiency, and renewable energy. Now, efficiency is fairly self-explanatory, but the idea of sufficiency is based on the 1985 study by the Brazilian scientist Jose Goldenberg, who asked the question, how much energy is necessary for a good life? Goldenberg determined that below 1,000 watts per person per year, people's lives are improved if they can raise their energy consumption. But his research also showed that increases above and beyond 1,000 watts per person per year did not improve quality of life. Now, the goal was set at 2,000 watts as a way of balancing the high energy demands for heating in cold climates with the lower energy demands of warmer climates. Now, finally, they made renewable energy the last of the 3 strategies in recognition of the idea that just because an energy source is renewable does not mean that it should be used to excess. This is meant to counter what's known as Jevons paradox, which suggests that increasing the efficiency of any resource can actually lead to an increase in the overall consumption of that resource rather than a decrease. Now, although the real-life location doesn't match that of Mary Murphy's co-op in Robinson's novel, he was almost certainly referencing one of 2 housing cooperatives in Zurich that are certified as 2,000 watt sites. One of those is the Kalkbreite cooperative, which we see here, which was completed in 2014 and consists of 97 units of housing with a total population of around 300, as well as many common facilities, including communal kitchens, a sauna, music rooms, a workshop, and a library. There are an array of different unit types, ranging from standard apartments with between 2 and 5 bedrooms to very large apartments with as many as 17 bedrooms for large intergenerational families, as well as clusters of studio apartments with private bathrooms and small kitchenettes with a shared and communal kitchen. There's also a cluster of 20 mini apartments whose residents pay collectively for a staffed kitchen. All of the apartments are significantly smaller than the national average, and there are 9 guest units in the buildings, alleviating the need for extra bedrooms for temporary and infrequent guests in the individual units. There's also a large mix of non-residential uses, including offices, a cinema, cafes, a doctor's office, and a kindergarten. And the building is extremely energy efficient, conforming to the Swiss Minergie P Eco standard, which is one of the most stringent in the world. Energy is provided by a groundwater heat pump and by solar photovoltaics. There is no car parking on the site, but there is a car sharing system and a parking garage for a few hundred bicycles, as well as very good access to public transportation. In addition to the energy efficiency of buildings, how we source our food is another important way of being sustainable. There are myriad Solarpunk stories that discuss vertical farming, rooftop farming, organic farming, etc., Stories like Renan Barnardo's When It's Time to Harvest, Tessa Fisher's Recovering the Lost Art of Cuddling, Serena Ulabare's The Spiral Ranch, as well as her novella Another Life, in which the community of Otravita lives by the slogan, "Their life wasn't built for us, so we built another life." One story featuring farming that I want to highlight is Lavanya Lakshminarayan's Beyond the Bazaar, in which a community built in a former bus depot that has been transformed into a communal makerspace and a self-sufficient communal farm where, quote, "everyone's responsible for what we grow and eat in this community." And at the end of the story, a stranger who is visiting is perplexed by the community's ability to live outside of the capitalist hegemony. And as he is sent away by his tour guide, Nadira, she tells him, "When you return to your life, what you consider normal, I hope you'll remember that there are choices. Yours is not the only way." And I highlight this story in particular because by appropriating the old bus depot, the community of Outer Nuluru in this story has built their cooperative in the post-industrial ruins of mainstream society. And that's similar in some ways to what has been done at the Kailash Eco Village in Portland, Oregon, which renovated a dilapidated old apartment building into a low-impact community of 32 apartments surrounded by individual garden plots, a shared community garden, a fruit orchard with 53 trees, rain gardens, wetlands, pollinator gardens, and more. And there are a bunch of environmental benefits of urban gardening and farming, including reducing the carbon footprint associated with food production and transportation, improving air and water quality, increasing biodiversity, mitigating the urban heat island effect, and managing stormwater runoff. So now I want to shift to discussing the economic benefits of collective housing. And it's important to acknowledge the ongoing housing crisis. We all know about it. We're all affected by it in one way or another, whether directly or indirectly. So before I get into how collaborative housing can help, let's dig into this a bit to better understand what the housing crisis actually means. One of the root causes of the housing crisis is the neoliberal financialization of the housing market, and the fact that as a society, we're now building housing as a commodity and as an asset in an investment strategy, rather than as a basic infrastructure of humanity. And this results in absurd things, like the possibility that your house, if you're lucky enough to own one, is earning more money than you do. A 2021 study showed that home appreciation exceeded the median yearly wages of people in 25 out of 38 major metropolitan areas in the United States, with the average appreciation of a home exceeding $100,000 in 11 of those areas. This, of course, increases the gap between the haves and the have-nots, between the poor and the rich. The corporatization of the rental market is a big part of the problem. There's been a massive shift in the ownership of rental units. In 2001, only about 18% of rental units were owned by a corporation, whereas as we see in this pie chart here, today more than 50% of them are. While individual investors still own about 70% of all rental properties, the vast majority of those properties are only a single unit. Meanwhile, corporate entities own the majority of large, multi-unit rental properties. This has served to transform housing from a basic human necessity into an asset to be bought and sold, just like stocks and bonds. And as large corporations have increased their share of the rental market, they've also begun using AI-powered rent-setting algorithms. And in 2023, it's estimated that renters in the US spent an extra $3.8 billion on rent as a result of these rent-setting algorithms. One of the algorithm's developers was even quoted as saying that human rental agents had, quote, too much empathy in comparison to the algorithm, and therefore they were losing money. Now, to be clear, we are building housing. That isn't the problem. Last year in the US, we saw a record high in the number of new apartments delivered. However, we're building far too much luxury housing because, of course, that's where all the profit is. We need to be building the right type of housing, social housing, affordable housing, and what we call the missing middle housing. For instance, if we look at New York City, in 2021, the overall vacancy rate was about 4.5%. But as we see here, there is a stratified market in New York's rental housing. High-cost units have a relatively high vacancy rate of more than 12%. Meanwhile, low-cost apartments have a vacancy rate of less than 1%. There are enough total units to meet demand, but the vast majority of the available units are unaffordable to the majority of New Yorkers. This financialization of housing has even resulted in the development of a new building typology known as the pencil tower that is particularly prominent in New York City. Many of these towers along the so-called Billionaires Row in Manhattan, even if they are fully sold, sit more than half empty most of the time because the units are owned by the super rich who have multiple homes around the world. And the penthouse of one of these buildings sold for the astonishingly stupid amount of $238 million. This physical embodiment of income inequality in the form of real estate is addressed by Kim Stanley Robinson in New York 2140 as the character Amelia Black pilots her airship into the city after a storm. Broadcasting on her cloud program, she says, quote, "Well, folks, you can see that those super scrapers came through the storm just fine. It's too bad they're mostly empty right now. I mean, they're residential towers supposedly, but they were always too expensive for ordinary people to afford. They're like big granaries for holding money, basically. You have to imagine them all stuffed to the top with dollar bills." Amelia continues. She says, "So really these towers are just assets. They're money. They're like big, tall, purple gold bars. They're everything except housing." And as if these super tall, super luxury towers weren't enough, this tower, planned for Dubai, will be built in partnership with a luxury jewelry company and will literally be encrusted with gemstones. I wish it was a joke, but it's not. This image of that same building on the left was just too similar to the depiction of the Arium in Netflix's Altered Carbon to not point out that for some reason the ultra-rich just can't seem to understand that cyberpunk dystopias are supposed to be critiques of what not to do. Now, these issues of income inequality and housing justice are central to Alex DeFrancesco's book, All City, in which, for a brief moment, a diverse group of characters live in a micro-utopia of their own making in a luxury building in Brooklyn. Set in the near future, in the aftermath of a superstorm, the characters live communally, sharing resources like food, water, and other supplies, and working together through an array of committees to operate on a system of consensus. And as DeFrancesco, the author, says here, the way ownership is dictated is on the desires of those who have money to protect their rights to a space. In the book, one of the characters, Michaela, describes the situation within the building. "The door was never locked. We had never fixed the lock we broke to get in here that first day. There was no need. Everything we had, we shared. Everything belonged to everybody." Now, this situation of a disadvantaged and marginalized population appropriating a space of capital, recalls the famous Torre David, a 45-story office tower in Caracas, Venezuela, that was abandoned during construction after the death of its developer. After sitting empty for more than a decade, it was appropriated by squatters in 2007 and became the home to more than 800 families. At its peak, the building was home to as many as 5,000 people before the government evicted and relocated most of the residents. Now, Federico Savini is a key thinker about the relationships between degrowth and city planning. And as we'll see later, he's also one of the founders of one of the cooperatives that I'll discuss. But here, Savini says, the commoning of housing is the strongest available way of prefiguring a degrowth imaginary of planning. And as he goes on to suggest, it's important to recognize that housing is not a commodity, but is an essential social good. He goes on to say these spaces entail commoning and that they denote collective ownership, democratic control, conviviality, and solidarity, which I think all of us here today would agree are some of the central concepts of Solarpunk. So it's important, I think, to understand that to a large degree, the housing crisis is a feature of the neoliberal capitalist system under which we're forced to operate. It isn't a bug or a glitch in the system. It's how the system is designed to work. It's extracting capital at the maximum rate possible to transfer wealth from the poor to the ultra wealthy. And so at some point, we have to realize that we can't solve a problem using the system that created the problem. That's why these decommodified forms of housing are so important. So then, what are some of the alternatives to the status quo of private housing ownership? Again, Solarpunk narratives can give us some hints. Cheryl Ntumi's story, The Ghost of Zablui Estate, which is set in Ghana, says, quote, "Gone are the days of private property. Now communities build a home together and own it together." Lilac, or the low-impact living affordable community in Leeds, England, is one such place that is designed and owned together. Lilac is the first mutual home ownership society, or MHOS, in the UK. It's a community of some 20 households, along with a common house, that was built using passive house principles, although they didn't quite meet the requirements for certification. But as a result, Lilac has a carbon footprint that's 65% less than an average household in the UK. But the most innovative feature about Lilac is their form of ownership. When they were developing their project, they worked with the New Economics Foundation and the Cooperative Development Society, which published this report here in 2003, to develop the legal framework for their mutual home ownership society, which is aimed specifically at the intermediate housing market in the UK, which in this case means the 40% of the population in the UK who don't qualify for housing assistance on one side, but cannot afford to buy a house in the lowest quartile of the housing market. And so the target audience is working class folks, like teachers, public sector workers, and tradespeople. Now, the MHOS model is really quite complicated. I'll try to explain it briefly, and if you're interested in finding out more, there are a bunch of resources available on their website. The MHOS owns both the homes and the land that they're built on. And just as an aside, incorporating with this approach with a community land trust would make this even more affordable by eliminating the cost of the land. But at the start, each household makes a 10% deposit towards the portion of the overall debt associated with their individual home. Members then pay 35% of their net household income each month until they've fulfilled their portion of the debt. This amount then can also adjust up or down depending on the circumstances of the household. Once a member completes the repayment on the debt associated with their unit, Then they pay just 10% of their income to cover the maintenance and community costs. In addition, the growth of the value of the homes is tied to the average national income and not to the speculative housing market. So the project will remain affordable in perpetuity. And as an example, between 2013 and 2019, home prices at Lilac increased by about 2% per year, compared to the 4.5% for an average home in Leeds. Now, turning to Vienna, Austria, which is widely recognized as an important site of non-market housing innovations. Like most co-housing communities, Gleis 21, which we see here, was designed through a participatory process. The building is certified as a zero-energy house and consists of 34 residential units, with one of the units serving as a shared guest apartment for visitors. And interestingly, there is an additional 5 flex units, which are covered by the residents' rent and are made available as refugee accommodations through a local human rights organization. There's also a bunch of neighborhood-facing spaces on the ground floor and all of the communal spaces for the residents on the top floor. Now, unlike Lilac's MHOS, Gleis 21 is a more traditional cooperative in that members can't sell their unit on the private market when they move away. Instead of owning their flats, they own shares in the limited profit building company that owns the building. At the start, when members move in, they pay a deposit of 580 euros per square meter based on the size of their unit, which honestly is quite expensive. It starts at around $20,000 or 20,000 euros. If they later move on, they get that money back, plus a bit more depending on how long they've lived there. And then their monthly rent averages around 600 euros a month, which is their share of the overall mortgage payment. This monthly rent is about 25% lower than comparative market rate rents. And once the overall mortgage payment for the project is fulfilled, the monthly rents could, theoretically at least, be reduced further. Now, Vienna is important because it has a long history of building decommodified social housing dating back to the early 20th century, especially during the so-called Red Vienna period between 1919 and 1934, when the city built some 400 housing hofs, or courtyard buildings, like those seen here, providing some 60,000 units that would house 1/8 of the population of the city at the time, including one of the most famous, the Karl Marx Hof, which was completed in 1930, and just as a fun fact, is one of the longest single housing blocks in the world at 1,100 meters long. Now, because of the sheer amount of non-market housing, the thing about Vienna in particular that I want to point out is that its housing market as a whole is much more affordable than other similar cities. Vienna is a city of tenants. 76% of the population rent their home. The city is home to about 1 million housing units, and 43% of them are affordable units, split evenly, roughly, between publicly owned social housing on the one hand, and partially subsidized cooperatives like Gleis 21 that are owned by limited profit companies on the other hand. As a result, Vienna is what's called an integrated housing market, meaning that nonprofit and for-profit landlords compete for the same tenants, thus keeping rents low for everyone. And still today, the city touts the Vienna model of social housing and invests approximately 450 million euros in affordable housing each year. Furthermore, housing of all types in Vienna is of incredibly high quality because of the city's housing competition process. Now, as a quick side note, this sort of massive investment in public housing is literally illegal in the United States as a result of something called the Faircloth Amendment, which effectively caps the number of public housing units at the number of units that existed on October 1st, 1999. So one of the biggest things you can do to support the construction of more affordable and public housing, is to support Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal for public housing, the centerpiece of which is repealing the Faircloth Amendment. And without this, it's basically impossible to ever build enough affordable housing in the US. Now, finally, I want to shift to discussing the social benefits of collective housing, which I think may actually be the most important aspect of cooperative forms of housing. This is important because it's one possible way to address the ongoing and deepening loneliness epidemic. In this report that we see here, Dr. Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General of the US under the Obama and Biden administrations, states, quote, "Loneliness is far more than just a bad feeling. It harms both individual and societal health. The mortality impact of being socially disconnected is similar to that caused by smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day, and even greater than that associated with obesity and physical inactivity." And so it's important to recognize that the typical single-family house, or even the individual apartment flat, reifies this isolation and loneliness into the built form of our homes, the place where the average American spends more than 18 hours a day. And the so-called American dream, which of course at this point has spread to other parts of the world as well, of a detached single-family home surrounded by a large yard, is an inbuilt pattern of isolation. Those of us who are gathered virtually here today know how important the idea of community and solidarity is to Solarpunk in all of its forms. It's probably the most essential ingredient in any of the Solarpunk futures that we're trying to build. And so, not surprisingly, different forms and flavors of community are explored in nearly every Solarpunk story. The book Everything for Everyone is a future history formatted as a collection of oral history interviews with folks who lived through the revolutionary acts that led to the formation of the New York Commune in 2052 within the narrative of the book. Not surprisingly, cooperative living arrangements are discussed in several of these interviews. And in one chapter, we hear this from a character who lived in the teenagers' creche of the St. George Commune on Staten Island. They say this: "Yeah, it's so important. Kids need both support and space to figure things out. And the shape of that space needs to change and grow as the kid grows. But for lots of kids in the commune, their primary connections are with their immediate family unit. But then also the commune as a whole plays a role in their upbringing. There's usually a lot of fluidity and kids being able to move back and forth between their family's immediate suite or house and the surrounding community of the commune. Just eating together with the whole commune for 3 meals a day has a giant impact on expanding the child's social connections from early on." Another example comes from Nick Fuller Guggen's novel The Great Transition, which talks about how the cooperation involved in completing the kind of daily chores of the community builds community. And there's an important point to make here. In co-housing and co-living communities, the typically unseen labor of domestic care work, the cleaning of the house, the cooking of meals, raising of children, caring of aging parents, becomes a valuable and visible contribution to the community as a whole. Anna Soon's story, Coriander, explores the importance of food and eating together as an important part of building community, saying, "Food is home, food is family, food is love." And that is something that is common to almost all of the narratives of collective living, the importance of simply sitting around a table and sharing a common meal as a way to build community. Sharing a meal is a feature of almost every cooperative community that I've researched. For some, it's every night. For others, it's a couple of times a week. And for some, it's once a month or so. And from my own personal experience, my family has a relationship with another family in our neighborhood that has children the same ages as my children that occasionally resembles something like co-housing at a distance. We recently vacationed together, and we oftentimes share a meal once a week, usually centered around watching the weekly episode of whatever Star Wars show is currently streaming. The photo on the bottom right here is from our first Star Wars viewing party for The Mandalorian. And so, as a big Star Wars fan, I can't help myself here. It must be said, this is the way. Although I'm focusing right now on the social benefits of collective housing, there are also environmental benefits to having these communal meals. First, it's more energy efficient to have a small team of folks cooking a large meal in a communal kitchen than it is for each household to be cooking individual meals. In addition, there are less resources needed to have one or two high-quality versions of each different type of appliance, rather than a dozen or more cheaper ones spread out amongst each individual house, which then will need to be replaced more often. Second, there's typically less food waste, since any leftovers can be shared and creatively repurposed. There's also typically less packaging waste as the result of bulk purchasing. Third, when you're only in charge of cooking a meal once a week or so, depending on the size of the community and the arrangement of the community's rules, it's much easier to plan healthy meals than it is when you have to feed your family multiple times every single day, like I do as the primary cook for my family. Thus, these meals can be prepared with locally sourced ingredients that reduce miles traveled from farm to table and lowering transportation-related emissions. And from a community and culture standpoint, shared meals also exposes people, especially kids, to a wider variety of food cultures as neighbors bring their own experiences to the communal table. In another chapter of Everything for Everyone, a character named Lateef Timbers describes moving into a commune in Brooklyn. Timbers says, quote, "Paulina took us around and showed us a lot of different options. Some chaps lived in small subunits and big apartment buildings. Some chaps lived in bigger groups in a house or a brownstone type situation, but mostly people still ate together in the canteen." And this mix of different forms of collective living is at the heart of this project, De Neue Mint, which is currently being built and is almost complete in Amsterdam. And one of the founders of this cooperative is Federico Savini, who I mentioned earlier. In this relatively small building, there's an interesting mix of different living arrangements. On the ground floor, highlighted in green to the left, are 15 independent social housing units, flanking each side of the shared courtyard. One of these units is reserved to provide housing for undocumented political refugees. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of the project's design is the 5 co-living groups that will inhabit the mid-rise portion of the building, highlighted here in blue. Each of these floors includes 5 individual bedrooms, a shared living space, and a shared kitchen, and the rooms are only 500 euros a month. And one of these floors is being reserved for a co-living group of seniors, ages 55 and up. This project's dedication to one of their co-living groups being housed by seniors is important given the aforementioned loneliness epidemic, which is particularly devastating for seniors. It's also an important response to demographic trends that show that family sizes are shrinking around the world. A recent study predicts that in 2095, the average person will have 35% fewer relatives. This means that the average 65-year-old woman, who in 1950 would have had an average of 41 living relatives, would only have 25 living relatives in 2095. And this shrinking family size, combined with the increased tendency of people to move away from their birthplace, results in an emptying out of the familial network that leaves seniors vulnerable. And so collective forms of living offer one way of rethinking the traditional support systems of the family by shifting the emphasis away from the biological family to broader networks of solidarity and what we might call chosen families. In many ways, the people in these cooperative communities end up being a chosen family, like in Susan K. Quinn's novel, When You Had Power, where the main character describes joining this collective home. That was part of the deal in joining a family, she says. You contributed some of your income, but more importantly, you took care of each other, not just chores, but everything. This is also seen in the story News from 24/7 in the book Half-Earth Socialism, in which characters discuss this over lunch. I can see myself living there when I'm old, said Octavia. There's so many elderly people living in the dorms. They love it. You can just see it in their eyes. There are plenty of ways for them to help out the community, like watching the kids or tending the garden. So much better than the old days when they were just shuffled away into isolation because they weren't profitable. And someplace like this already exists in the Dutch city of Deventer. Humanitas is an intergenerational co-living community in which 6 college students are provided a free place to live in exchange for spending at least 30 hours a month socializing with the senior residents. Another community aimed specifically at seniors is the New Ground Older Women's Co-housing Community in London, England, which is home to 26 residents ranging from ages 58 to 94 in 25 different flats. Finally, I want to acknowledge that collective living is not always easy. Living closely with others, family or not, can be challenging at times. And this is recognized by Jerry Jarreet, who's one of our speakers today, in her story, Benny and Shia are leaving. At the beginning of the story, the title characters, a single mother and her daughter, live in a shared house where they rent a large bedroom and cook and eat downstairs with 26 neighbors. But after Shia loses her job as a teacher, they're forced to relocate to a rural village where they move into a cooperative village house. And their first days there are rough as they adjust to the new living quarters, their assigned chores, and their new neighbors. But the story ends on a positive note as Shia recognizes the potential of their new life. So, to wrap things up, everything that I've discussed and shown today, the communities, the excerpts from the stories, the artwork that I've used to illustrate some of the ideas, some of which comes from some of my students, but most of which comes from the Solarpunk Story Seed library online, as well as all of the amazing ideas that I'm sure we'll hear throughout the day today, they all represent micro-utopias and microcosms of hope, prefigurative ways that people are already working towards a better future. These non-market and decommodified types of collective housing that I've shown today represent just one of the many seeds that we can plant and grow into a post-capitalist solarpunk world. None of them are perfect, but they're all steps in the right direction. And so with that in mind, I'll close with the words of the historian Howard Zinn, who said, quote, "We don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents. And to live now as we think humans should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory." And so, thanks again to the conference organizers. Thank you to all of you for your time. I'd be happy to take any questions now. And if there are any that we don't get to in the allotted time, I'll be on Discord for the rest of the day. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Philip. That was wonderful. I will just go and read out some of the questions that we have so far. So the first one starting off is, I work with urban planners. There are many policy hurdles to limited equity housing cooperatives and other models. What kind of policy organizing and advocacy have been effective? From Caleb.
So I think it differs across different countries. Kind of different countries have their different models. Germany has a model called Baugruppen, which is similar to some of the cooperatives that I showed in Zurich and in Vienna. And the main kind of thing for them is that they eliminate the developer and therefore the kind of profit motive of the developer. And then, as I mentioned, in the US, it's damn near impossible to build more social housing because of these kind of rules that are kind of in place. It's really, there's a lot of kind of advocacy work that needs to be done to better enable these things to kind of happen within the kind of capitalist framework that we're kind of stuck within right now. I'm sure there's plenty more that I could say about that. That's probably easier to get into more detail on the Discord later, if that would be possible.
Totally. So the next question is, maybe you'll elaborate on this later on, but I'd be curious to know whether the generation that grew up in the 70s/80s co-housing communities carried on that way of living after they had kids themselves.
Yeah, so in my research, there's a lot of kind of interviews that I've seen with folks that kind of grew up in there. Some kids, right, moved away, but a lot of kids, went away to college and were kind of astonished by like the way that most people were living. And so there are many kind of second and even third generation folks who are now living in these communities. So I think certainly it's not for everyone. But from what I've seen and the kind of research and the kind of interviews that I've read, a lot of those people do tend to kind of maintain their connection to the co-housing communities that they grow up in, or move to new ones, or even establish new ones themselves.
All right, and the next kind of question we have, I've never heard of Jevons paradox, so thank you for that. But what if energy is cheap/efficient and low to no impact on the environment? In that case, does it matter if there's an increase in use, or is the inherent consumption of energy, even no impact energy, counter to Solarpunk principles?
So I was introduced to Jevons paradox actually by one of Kim Stanley Robinson's books. There's a chapter, I think it's in The Ministry for the Future, in which he talks about it in particular. And the problem is that, and we see this like we've seen that this sort of trend is that even as we are shifting to more and more sustainable forms of power, right? Solar photovoltaics and wind power, all of the kind of renewable forms of power, if we continue to increase the amount of energy that we need, then we still have to be producing more and more and more power. And so the efficiency part of it, the slowing down of the growth of the amount of power that we expend is important, because otherwise we continue, even if we convert 100% to renewable energy, we have to continue building more and more solar panels, more and more wind turbines. And so there's this constant, right, extraction of natural resources that happens. And so we need to, of course, adopt more sustainable technologies, but also from a kind of sociocultural standpoint, flatten the curve in the amount of energy that we're expending and using. So that's kind of where that idea comes from.
All right, next question. First time father to be here. Is there any way to practice these Solarpunk community type ideals when bringing up youth? From Lucas.
So yes, there's a few things about that I originally had in my talk, but I had to cut for the sake of time. So thank you for this question. So one thing is co-parenting is not quite the right word for it, but kind of the sharing of care And so throughout my kids' lives, my kids are now 10 and about to turn 12 in a couple of weeks. There have been, I've had kind of three different arrangements with friends in which we do a kind of parent sharing. The earliest one was when my oldest daughter was like between the age of 1 and 2, and it was me and two of my like closest mom friends. And basically, 1 or 2 days a week, the kids would all be at our house and I would watch them. Another day or two a week, they'd be at another parent's house. And right. And so the kids kind of rotated around between these three different houses that enabled each of us to get our work done. And that sort of arrangement has, for me, we've done it in multiple different ways. Um, with different families as people have moved on and whatever. And so even despite the fact that all of those families that we've kind of done this with, as well as the family now that I mentioned in the talk, even though we all live separately, right? We are, part of the kind of, the village, right? And so that we can kind of work together to help each other out, right? And so like that family that I talked about in the talk, you know, if say it's our anniversary and my wife and I want to go out, right? We know that most likely we can kind of dump our kids on them and they'll have a sleepover and we can go out and have a nice night together. So I think that when we think beyond the bounds of our individual house and our, right, the kind of nuclear family, there are a whole bunch of kind of innovations to be looked at that relate to the raising of our children. That then hopefully, right, like then those children go on to be, kind of budding solar punks as well. And right, one generation builds upon the next generation.
So the next question we have is, how do communal living arrangements with communal meals deal with dietary restrictions between religious restrictions, philosophical restrictions, sensitivities, and allergies? It can be a nightmare to prepare a meal for multiple people from Garnet.
Yes. So one thing that I've seen in the research is that a lot of the communal meals tend to be vegetarian or vegan, um, and that uh, they try to be as kind of cognizant as possible of their own community's kind of needs, and will maybe perhaps, right, make, a primary thing that kind of works for everyone and then supplemented by other things. But from what I've seen, right, they work together, right? That's part of the kind of solidarity, is kind of recognizing everyone's kind of requirements and needs and, accommodating them. And so, of course, how easy that is depends on the size of the community. But from what I understand, from what I've seen in all of my research, is that it tends to just kind of work its way out because of, right, the kind of spirit of the community, because of the solidarity amongst the people.
Do you know of any examples of community living in the global south, Emilio?
Yes, so there's one slide that I was really, really angry to cut out at the very last minute. There's a community called Nashira, Nashira, that is in Colombia. That is a co-housing community for women who have been displaced by Colombia's civil war, or who have been displaced because they're victims of domestic or sexual violence. And I can put the link to that into the Discord. But it's a really wonderful community. I think it's about 80 houses, and it's run by women. It's built by women, and the housing is free. and kind of paid for through kind of sweat equity that the women literally build this community themselves. But I can certainly put more about that uh, into um, into the chat on Discord.
All right. Maybe one or two more questions for you, and then we'll be heading to the break. Uh, not a not a question, but an observation. Indian families prior to the 1990s, post-economic liberalization, shift away from the system of joint families, almost like a co-living setup to nuclear families from ARPAN. And the last question. Beyond the policy hurdles you addressed before, what are some of the other barriers to more of these communities forming in the States? What do you foresee as an ideal setting for these communities to grow and respond to the barriers in terms of location, habitant demographics, and reliance on existing systems until independence is sustainable?
Yeah, so as far as barriers, that question sparked something that I remembered. That's another thing that I had to cut from the talk. There is a community, it's somewhere in the Midwest. I can't remember exactly where it is off the top of my head, but I can again look it up and put it into the Discord. But there's a city in the Midwest of the US that uh, basically tried to or has tried to make co-living illegal. And the rules were something to the effect of that no more than three unrelated people could cohabit within an individual apartment or something like that. I can find the details and put it into the chat. But basically, as co-living is becoming more popular, and also I should say that in cities like New York or Seattle or San Francisco, right, places with really high real estate costs, co-living has to a certain extent already been started to be co-opted and in certain terms. And so kind of in response to that, we're seeing pushback against that, where certain kind of communities or municipalities are trying to, right, they're kind of scared, right? They're because these things are different and right, they don't want like a commune or something like that. But I think that uh, there are all sorts of things that we can advocate for from a housing standpoint to enable these sorts of things, right? Things like what we call accessory dwelling units, which the most common kind of version of is the kind of like garage apartment or like a secondary smaller apartment, you know, in the backyard of a larger house. Those are things that we can advocate for that allows both for kind of increased density, but also potentially, right, interesting forms of community. You know, they're also sometimes known as the granny flat, right? Where, you know, an elderly member of the family might live in a kind of small, semi-separate apartment, but still connected to the main household. Um, and so I think like just the main thing is really to just kind of like be able to look past this kind of paradigm that we're constantly told is the thing that we should be striving for, the thing that is quote unquote normal, and just be more experimental in the way that we kind of put our lives together.